So, like a compassionate but hard-hitting gangster that you are, very recently, you interacted with SBF on. I like how you adjust the suspenders as you're saying this. You interacted on Twitter Spaces with SBF and really put his feet to the fire with some hard-hitting questions. What did you ask him? What did you learn from that interaction?
Sure, I should say first, this was not a willing interaction. I mean, I thought that was kind of the funny part of it because I've been asking him for an interview for a while. He's been giving interviews to nearly everyone who wants one, big channels, small channels. He didn't give me one, but I managed to get some by sneaking up on some Twitter Spaces and DMing the people and like being like, "Hey, can I come up?" So I didn't get him to ask everything that I wanted because he like would leave sometimes, after I asked some of the questions. But really, what I asked was about this 8 billion and zooming in on the improbability of his lack of knowledge. It's sort of like if you run a company and you know the insides and outs, and you're the top of your field, top in class, and all of a sudden it all goes bust, and you say, "I had no idea how any of this worked.
Yeah.
I didn't know." It's like the guy who runs Whataburger saying, "I didn't know where we sourced our beef. I didn't know where we." That's a Texas example, actually.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Let's take it like worldwide. Walmart, like, I didn't know we used Chinese manufacturers. It's like that's impossible. To become Walmart, you have to know how your supply chain works. You have to know, even if you're at a high level, you know how this stuff works.
Can I do a hard turn on that and go
Sure.
as one must to Hitler? Hitler's writing is not on any of the documents around, as far as I know, on the final solution. So, in some crazy world, he could theoretically say, I didn't know anything about the death camps." So there's this plausible deniability in theory. So but that most people would look at that and say, it's very unlikely. You don't
Well,
know.
especially if all the insiders are coming out and saying, no, 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 of course he knew. He was directing us from the top. I mean, what's interesting about the structure, and like, I love the nitty
Sorry,
gritty.
we're back to SBF. We
Yeah.
went to Hitler.
Sorry.
Now we're
sorry.
back to
I
the
wanted to
SBF.
turn us as fast as possible away from Hitler.
I
I
apologize. So the insiders in what? Alameda Research.
Alameda Research. What was interesting is that there was this sort of one-way window going on between Alameda and FTX, where FTX employees didn't know a lot of what was going on. Alameda insiders, and I would say by design, knew almost everything that was going on at FTX. And so I think that was really interesting from the perspective of a lot of the so-called, like, what he's trying to ascribe to as like failures or mistakes or ignorance and negligence, when looked at closely, are much more designed, and they sort of don't arise spontaneously. Because like, let's say, so there's this thing in banking and like trading where if I run a bank and you run like a trading firm, we need to have informational walls between us because there's huge conflicts of interest that can arise, right? So the negligent argument might be that like, oh, we just didn't know. We're sort of these dumb kids in the Bahamas, so we shared information equally. But when you see a one-way wall, that starts to look a lot different, right? If I have a back-end source of looking at, or sorry, you're the trading firm, so you have a back-end way to look at all my accounts, and I have no idea that you're doing that, that all of a sudden looks like a much more designed thing. When it would be plausible, let's say, going to use another analogy too, if you're saying, look, I commingled funds because I was so bad at corporate structures, you would expect those companies to have a very simple corporate structure because you didn't know what you're doing, right? But what we see with FTX and Alameda is they had something like 50 companies and subsidiaries and this impossibly complicated web of corporate activity. You don't get there by accident. You don't wake up and go, oh, I designed like this watch that ticked a very specific way, but it was all accidental. If you really didn't know what you were doing, you'd end up with a simple structure. So even just like from a fundamental perspective, what SBF was doing and like the activities they were engaging in were so complicated and purposely designed to obfuscate what they were doing. It's impossible to subscribe to the negligence argument. And I want to quickly say too, like, I don't think a lot of people have honed in on this. There was insider trading going on from Alameda's perspective, where they would know what coins FTX was going to list on their exchange. And there's a famous effect where, let's say you're this legitimate exchange, you list a coin, the price spikes. Insiders told me it was a regular practice for Alameda insiders to know that FTX was going to list a coin, and as a company, buy up that coin so they could sell it after it listed. And they made millions of dollars. How do you do that accidentally?
Yeah, and that's illegal.
Totally illegal.
Right.
So that's illegal from and if an individual does it, it's illegal, it's fraud. What if a company is systematically doing it? And you can't tell me that FTX or someone at FTX wasn't feeding that information to Alameda or somehow giving them keys to know that. And that would happen at the highest level. It would happen at SBF's level. And this is why his arguments of, I was dumb, I was naive, I was sort of ignorant, are so preposterous, because he's dumb and ignorant the second it becomes criminal to be smart and sophisticated, right?
But then also coming out and talking about it, which is
it's a bizarre move.
It's a bizarre and almost a dark move. Can you tell the story of the 8 billion? You mentioned 8 billion. What's the 8 billion? What's the missing 8 billion?
Yeah, so it's really interesting because it's sort of like wire fraud. He's sort of copping to smaller crimes to avoid the big crime. The big crime is you knew everything and you were behind it, right? The smaller crimes are like a little wire fraud here, little wire fraud there. So what the 8 billion is that FTX didn't always have banking. It's hard to get banking as a crypto exchange. There's all these questions of where's the money coming from? Is it coming from money launderers? So for a variety of reasons, it's always been hard for exchanges to get bank accounts. So before, when FTX was just getting started, they didn't have a bank account. So how do you put money on FTX? Well, they would have you wire your money to their trading firm. Their wiring instructions would go to their trading firm. It's easier to get banking as a trading firm. So you'd put your money with the trading firm, and then they'd credit you the money on FTX. Okay, first of all, this is a whole circumvention of all these banking guidelines and regulations. That's the first thing that I think is illegal. But basically what SBF argued is that there was an accounting glitch, error, problem, where when you'd send money to Alameda, even though they'd credit you on FTX, they wouldn't safeguard your deposits. Your deposits would go into what he called a stub account, which is just some account that's not very well labeled, kind of like a placeholder account. And he didn't realize that those were Alameda's funds, or they were playing with those funds, and that they basically should have safeguarded that for customers. That's his explanation. It's preposterous because it's $8 billion. But anyways.
Just poor labeling of accounts.
Of an $8 billion account. I mean,
what's it's a billion between
a billion. This is
I do this all the time.
This is the craziest thing. He was talking to me, and at one point in the conversation, he's like, "Yeah, I didn't have precise because he said I didn't have knowledge of Alameda's accounts." And I said, "Well, Forbes a month ago was getting detailed accounting of Alameda," and he goes, "Oh, that wasn't detailed accounting. I just knew I was right within 10 billion or so." What is that error margin? $10 billion? For a company that is arguably never worth more than 100 million. Yeah. Probably never even worth more than 50 billion. Your error margin is $10 billion. You have to be, this is a guy who is sending around statements that there was no risk involved. And you're telling me he had a error margin of $10 billion? That is the difference between a healthy company and a company so deep underwater you're going to jail. So you have to believe that he is impossibly stupid and square that with the sophistication that he brought to the table. I think it's an impossible argument.